Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I'm here for my LEC quarterfinals and semifinals overview and analysis video. We know our top 4 teams left here in the LEC. In this video, we're going to be going over technically the round number 3 best of 5 matchup, the 3rd, 4th place matchup, as I guess you guys would know it. I'm calling it the quarterfinals, at least in terms of my title. And then, of course, we will also be going over the semifinals, the winner of that matchup taking on G2. I am very excited to cover it. Hope you guys are excited as well. If you want to know my thoughts on everything that's happened in the LEC, specifically in the playoffs, check out the playlist up in the iCard right now. That's every single week of the LEC done in an overview, kind of way, and you can check that out if you're interested in my thoughts on every single game. But of course, all of my reviews for the playoff series are in there as well, including the Fnatic G2 best of 5 that happened last weekend. So if you're interested, check that out. But today we're going to be covering these 2 best of 5s, the 2 best of 5s that take place right before the finals. So I'm excited to preview everything. If you are as well, let me know down in the comments section below. But without further ado, let's jump right into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go over every single game in both of the series that we had. We will be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each game that we cover. And at the end of the video, we will be lightly previewing the finals. There definitely is going to be some conversation about, who is going to be favorited no matter who ends up making the finals, but it's going to be an interesting conversation regardless. There are still open spots in the season finals to be grabbed. I didn't think that was the case, but that clearly is still the case. I was corrected on that in the comments in the previous video, which we will touch upon in a second. But of course, all of today will be spent covering the quarters and the semifinals. So without further ado, let's jump right into the analysis. And that means kicking it off with round number 3, the quarterfinals here. And of course, it is a matchup between the number 2 seeded Team BDS and the number 5 seeded Corp. I'm really excited to go over this because this is one of those series that really is kind of a turning point for the rest of the LEC season. Not only because BDS really needs to start getting their act together because they've been really weak in the playoffs so far. They've really not been consistent at all, but Corp, to my understanding, actually still has an opportunity to qualify for the season finals. That's what I got wrong about the previous video. They don't need to get top 2. It technically is, still possible for them to make it because, as I didn't know, top 3 in summer automatically get into the season finals. And so you don't need to be top 6 in championship points in order to make it. And that's really good news for Corp. That means they are officially 1 series away from getting themselves there after going back-to-back 10th place. So this is a massive series for them, but of course BDS wants to fight as well. These 2 teams stack up in a pretty interesting way. When you look at the lane-by-lane breakdown, there are a couple of places that I think it's worth pointing out. I think bot lane is, pretty good for both teams. I think bot lane for Corp was worse in the regular season. I don't think that is really that bold of a take, but they have been significantly better. Targamas in particular in the playoffs, he's actually been really positive for this team in their best of 3 run. So we'll see. We'll see how things end up going because Ice and Labrav are what I would consider to be the most consistent bot lane in the league. Rahel and Luan are probably the most talented, but I don't know if you're going to get the same kind of game-to-game output of anybody as you're going to get out of Ice, who has just been on an absolute tear. He has been dominating games right now, especially in the playoffs. The rest of these lanes are very interesting. Nuke versus Vladi, that could potentially be in Corp's favor. Vladi has been excellent, I would argue better than Nuke over the course of this split in particular. He just doesn't have the longevity, and then the top side, that's where I think it starts to get a little bit more meh, like Closer and Sheo. I think both have been up and down. Sheo is somebody that I'm notoriously a bit lower on, but Closer, also somebody that hasn't really impressed me. He has basically been stuck on tank duty the entirety of their playoff run up until this point. We'll see if that changes in this series. And then Adam versus Kana, definitely the most, electric of these matchups in terms of fireworks potentially going off, both being very aggressive players. Kana probably going to want to take it a bit slower. Adam has been not so good in this playoff run for BDS. In fact, he's probably been this team's biggest problem so far in the best of 3 stage, but we all know on any given day, he can be the best player in the LEC. That's just how Adam ends up operating. Kana's been pretty good in this playoff run, but again, pretty inconsistent. So whoever ends up getting the better of this top lane matchup is definitely going to be in a good position. But as you can see, this is pretty even across the board. I think if Vladi and Targamas and Upset, they all have really good days, I think Corp's in a really good position to win this series. They've definitely been better, in my opinion, in the playoffs so far, but BDS, they should be better. On paper, they are the better team, and in the regular season, they performed like the better team. I think they have the best player in this series, in my opinion, in Ice, and that should be able to carry them over the edge, but they've also been really not consistent at all in the playoff run. They've been very lucky to even get here in the first place in terms of some of their results. So it's definitely going to be an interesting one, but I'm excited to see where things end up going. If we're going game by game, that means we get to start with game number 1, and the winner of game number 1 was Corp. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and what a crazy game number 1. I certainly did not expect the series to start off like this, let alone to have a game like this at all in the series. This was a wild one. I mean, BDS has absolutely no excuse for losing this game. Some untimely engages, some really bad picks, and a really awful fight at the end of the game ends up leaving them in a negative spot, ahead in kills, ahead in towers, 4 dragons, 2 barons. All of it's not enough for them to be able to close it out. We'll talk about some of the things they did right, some of the things they did wrong, but credit to Corp, who stuck in there. They kept their head down. They didn't panic when they were in bad situations, and they end up being able to take this game out of the hands of BDS when it really should have never been up for debate. Really excited to talk about it. Player of the game for me is going to go to Vladi in the mid lane. He's the best player on Corp. I don't even think this is disputable. Like, at this point, there really is no conversation. Vladi is Corp. He is the one that they run a lot of their late game through, and he has been able to carry them across the finish line. Upset and Targamas, like I said, have been better in the best of 3 stage, but Vladi has still been the one that is creating all of the opportunities and all of the chances for the rest of this team to even be here in the first place. I've been really excited about just how good he has been. He is the core of this team, and they can really build around him. He was essential in the back half of this game on Corki. Obviously, you would expect that because of the champion that he's playing, but even more so than just the champion, his individual decision-making and plays were excellent in this one. And he was really the one player on Corp that stood out to me in a really big positive way. I think Upset, Targamas, Kana all played relatively well. Closer, I think, had a pretty rough game in terms of his actual mechanics, but he gets the one smite when he really needs to in the back half of the game that really keeps this one alive for KC, and, that's massive. I think you can look at KC in total and say, well, your early game simply has to be better. If you're going to draft something like Ezreal Leona down in the bot lane, you need to have a plan to be able to answer the Ashe. If you're going to draft Twisted Fate in the top lane, you need to be able to get him out on the map and, create a lot of that macro chaos that he is supposed to create. A lot of those things didn't end up happening. You had to rely on just extending this game out as long as possible and essentially try to get a miracle steal and just wait for BDS to make a major mistake. They're not going to do that every single game of this series, or at least you can't expect them to do that every single game of this series. I think they're definitely going to be happy winning game number 1 because it puts you in such a good spot in these best of 5s, but it's certainly not a series ender by any means. BDS, for the most part, was the better team in this game, and I think a lot of that comes down to Ice and Labrav continuing to look amazing as a duo. Ice is just playing out of his mind right now. He is really asserting himself as maybe the best AD carry in the LEC right now. It's really between him and Rahel. Rahel's knocked out of the playoffs, though. He doesn't really have a chance to defend that title, and Ice has been going on an absolute tear. He is just dominating games, and it is kind of regardless of the champion. I know a lot of people bring up his Ashe. His Ashe is dominant, but he's been great on Zeri. He's been great on Jinx. He's been great on everything in this meta. Ezreal is something he was always known for back in Korea. There's really not a champion in the current ADC meta that doesn't fit Ice's playstyle, and that's what makes him so dangerous, is he's just so versatile. Labrav obviously helps with that a lot. A couple of really important peel moments from him on the Nautilus as we got further and further along in this game, but I feel bad. Ice he couldn't do it. He was so close to being the hyper carry that this team has kind of relied on him to be across this entire split, but the rest of this team just kind of let him down. Of course, Sheo losing that smite is obviously not ideal. It's funny because Sheo, one of his best traits is his ability to smite objectives. He's amazing at that, but couldn't quite be good enough in this one on a 50-50, and then dud of the game is going to go to Adam in the top lane. He's been really brutal in this playoff run. I don't really know if that's something I'm expecting to continue, but it certainly didn't go away here in game number 1, and he was kind of the reason that BDS ended up losing this game in the first place. Like I said, they were in a pretty good position. Ice was having a really good game. They had a lot of tools and avenues in order to close this out, but Adams engages. His over-aggression in the back half was game-losing. It was truly awful from him, and, his inability to stay calm, I think, in these big scenarios is really something that might hold this team back, and so you're looking at BDS really struggling at least to close out game number 1, 1, even if they didn't struggle a lot in the early game, and you're wondering if this is something that will continue to be an issue moving forward. The only way to know that, of course, is to see how the rest of these games play out, but for BDS, you just have to hope that the 90% of the game that you played where you were better than K-Corp is something that you can translate over to multiple games the rest of this series. But you're now down 0-1. You're now in a position where your back is up against the wall. You have to win 3 of the last 4 games in order to move on, and that's going to be a bit difficult to do even with Ice playing well. But for K-Corp, they're going to feel very lucky to walk out of game number 1 with a win. I certainly don't think that they feel great with how they played a majority of this game, specifically the early game, but that is all wiped away. You actually have an advantage from that, and you were able to win even in a situation where you played a little bit weaker than maybe you normally have played, and so you're in a pretty good position. If you can win game number 2, go up 2-0 in this series, that's massive for this team overall. That puts you, 1 win away. You put BDS in a horrible position, so a massive game number 2 for both of these teams, but only one of them is going to be able to take it. Who is going to do it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was BDS. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up this series at 1 apiece, and they desperately needed this kind of win to just come out here and dominate, to just come out here and be the better team. That's what you wanted to see out of BDS, especially after they basically threw away game number 1. This kind of is like a 2-0 series for them, at least in terms of how I would be viewing it. If I was both a player and a coach on BDS, I would try to implore to these players, like, you have been better. You are better right now. You just have to go out there and close this out. I think they played awesome in this game. There are multiple players that I want to point out having some really excellent performances, but for K-Corp on the other side, I think a flaw in terms of their flexibility and perhaps their consistency was definitely highlighted in a game like this, where they kind of moved away from the kinds of drafts that they had been going towards for most of the playoffs, keeping closer on something a little bit more contained, like a Maokai or a Sejuani, and letting Vladi be a primary carry, not asking for too much out of your bot lane. Like, it's been a bit of a controlled series, or controlled playoffs, I should say, for K-Corp, and they kind of moved into a different direction. They had the opportunity to take the brand, and they took it, and it didn't work out for them, and I think we'll talk about why I think this will be a pretty obvious fix, but it's definitely a bit concerning that the moment that they start to deviate from the formula, things start to go a little bit wrong, so we'll talk about that. For BDS, player of the game was honestly kind of hard because there were a couple of players who played great. At the end of the day, I narrowed it down to 2 people, either Ice or Sheo. I thought both of them were excellent here in game number 2. I'm going to give it to Ice on the Jinx because he was the damage carry and the one that they were facilitating and funneling, and quite frankly, Ice has just been better at the beginning part of this series. I almost gave him player of the game for game number 1, even on the losing side. It certainly was something I considered, but he's just ridiculous. He's playing at an unreal level right now. We are seeing Korean AD carries come over to the LEC and just dominate. And, it's something that we talked about a lot in the previous splits. You can definitely go back and look at my takes in the winter and in the spring split where I said that the AD carries in the LEC are the weakest that maybe any major region has ever had. Like, you just didn't have a lot of good AD carries in the LEC, quite frankly. There was nobody that stood out as being exceptional. You had mediocre ADCs having really good splits and then just completely falling off, and then you had bad players who would just be inconsistently up and inconsistently down. It just never felt like anybody could click. Ice is really one of those players that I think, was mediocre to super below average in Korea. Going back to his sandbox days, I've covered them a lot on the channel when I did my LCK reviews. He was a non-assuming AD carry player over in Korea. He just was kind of a guy. Comes over here to Europe, obviously spent some time with Zero Tenacity, but comes up here to BDS to replace Crowny, and it has immediately been a massive upgrade, and it really does show just how weak the AD carry pool, quite frankly, is for Europe right now, and just how not good it has been. Ice and Rahel and, players of that caliber have just come in, and really Noah last year have really come in and kind of just taken the top spots in terms of ADCs, and it's definitely something to take notice of, but Ice is definitely here to stay. That performance was legit. Sheo was also excellent in this game, and I really wanted to give him player of the game. This is kind of the opposite thing for these two teams. K-Corp often goes for things like the Sejuani, and BDS is the team that likes to go for these AP carries coming out of the jungle. It very much feels like BDS has always just been, well, let's find out what we need to do to get meta. That's always kind of been their mentality, but Sheo is a phenomenal facilitator. I still think it's his better role, and he showed that off here. I think he's had trouble adapting to the AP jungle meta. Just get him on things like Sedge and Maokai. He'll be just fine. I talk about this all the time, but it feels like the West is like the last to catch up to all of these big meta changes where Sedge and Maokai are now the two best junglers in the game once again, as proven by the LCK and the LPL. It seems like BDS has figured that out. Nuke was really good here. Labrav was really good. Adam was fine on the Mundo on the top side. Nothing to really write home about, but BDS in general just looked dominant across the board. Jungle Bot was really the standout, and I think Nuke had a good game. I think we'd be talking about him a bit more if Ice and Sheo weren't so good, but this is the exact kind of performance you wanted to see if you were a BDS fan, and for K-Corp, this is not good. You kind of are 0-2. Like I said, if BDS is kind of 2-0, then you're kind of 0-2 in terms of mentality in this series right now, and it really hasn't looked all that good through the first two games. Closer's going to get done of the game here for game number 2. This is the concern with taking him off of Sedge and Maokai, is that he was off of these champions for a lot of 2023 when he was on 100 Thieves, and it was kind of a disaster. He was really horrible last year, and this was a lot closer to that kind of performance than anything he had been giving over the playoffs up until this point. I still don't think he's been, like, exceptional for this team, even in a limited role. He's just kind of been a guy that allows players like Vladi and Upset to do their thing in a lot of cases, but when you put the onus on him, I'm really not sure he's the kind of guy that's going to carry the torch across the finish line for K-Corp. So Sheo completely outplaying him. That is a bit of a concern. I thought Targamas was relatively bad this game. I think his scoreline maybe looks a bit worse than the individual plays, but this was closer to regular season Targamas than it was to playoffs Targamas. Kana just was irrelevant. Vladi and Upset were generally whatever, but their counterparts on the other side of the matchup were definitely better. K-Corp just was the worst of these two teams in this matchup, and that simply has to be different. Like, you have to put up a fight somewhere on the map. A 25-minute loss in game number 2 is not really where you want to be. And yes, there's not a lot of momentum for K-Corp right now, but remembering that they're 1-1 in this series should be some sort of consolation prize. If they can get back on the board in game number 3, if they can, go up 2-1 in this series, everything that's happened in these first two games is just going to be erased. And for BDS, it's great that you won this, and it's great that you've probably looked like the better team through these first two games, but it doesn't matter if you can't win game number 3. If you go down 1-2, your back is really against the wall, and there's no more room for errors. And so this is a very pivotal middle game of the series. As you know, when it's 1-1, I consider game 3 to be the most important game in the entire series. So who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 3 was BDS. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to go up in this series 2-1, and they continue their success rate, I guess, at least so far in this series. This was a very sloppy, very brutal game for K-Corp, where it never really felt like they were in it. It always just felt like BDS was taking forever to end the game, but they end up with Infernal Soul. They end up with 3 different Barons over the course of this game, and they eventually are able to close it out. This was a hard one to win for K-Corp, I think, coming out of draft. I don't think this is one of those games where it's unwinnable. I think there are win conditions for this team. If you win hard enough in the early game, unfortunately, they just weren't able to do that. The moment that Alistair or Malphite or Morgana ever got into any of these fights, it was all over. There was literally nothing K-Corp was going to be able to do from that point onwards, and so they needed to play fast. Unfortunately, as you can see, this game went 42 minutes. It didn't go fast enough for them, and they end up losing it. A lot of things to point out as major weaknesses, but for BDS, I still don't think this team is playing all that well. This is not a clean victory. This is not a good victory for them. This was a lot closer to game number 1 than it was to game number 2, and that's really kind of a sad place to be. I think obviously there were some good moments in the final fights when you've got, Corki Kaisa with Infernal Soul just absolutely destroying people with every single bit of damage that they have, but before that, there really wasn't a lot of good going on outside of who I consider to be my player of the game, Sheo, in the jungle. He is playing awesome right now. The jungle gap in this series has been pretty massive. Closer has just quite not been good enough to go up against someone like Sheo. Closer was someone we identified as a potential weakness for this team going in, not only to this series, but obviously I was super low on him coming into the split. I don't really think he changed my opinion at all in the regular season. I think I said his name like 2 or 3 times throughout every single video that we've done. He's just not a player that we've talked about all that much, either good or bad. Unfortunately, he is getting exposed a bit in a pretty pivotal point right now, and Sheo is looking excellent. I know the Morgana might not be the most flashy player of the game pick here. From me, obviously, the Kaisa is the more obvious one. I think the Corki was probably the other one that I was definitely considering. Nuke in the mid lane was really good here in game 3, but It's really the Black Shield that is player of the game. It was unbreakthroughable. I know it's not a word, but I'm making it up right now. It was unbreakthroughable. That Black Shield was the true MVP. So Sheo is going to get MVP here. There literally was no way to ever kill any of the carries, or especially any of the frontliners on this team so long as Morgana was in these fights. Sheo played awesome. His pathing is great. He's just playing really well right now. For a player that honestly I've kind of disrespected over the course of this year, it's nice to see him really stepping up. Obviously, Ice, Labrov, Nuke, they definitely deserve a shout out for, in Nuke's and Ice's case, the damage they were able to do, and in Labrov's case, the setup that he was able to create. I thought all of them played relatively fine, even if there were some mistakes. Ice had a really bad positioning mistake. Nuke had a couple of weird plays that he ended up making. You know, it wasn't a perfect game from BDS, but it was enough to get them over the hump. Adam was still essentially invisible. Like, this guy just kind of existed. I understand, you know, R5 Malphite is just completely broken against Vi, Gnar, Tristana, Zeri. Like, there is almost no way to break through Malphite, but he still really wasn't involved in anything. Those ultimates really weren't connecting. This should have been an amazing Malphite game, and it just wasn't. I continue to be underwhelmed by Adam in the current playoff run, even though I'm a big fan of Adam's individual gameplay. But at that point, we're picking at straws. Like, BDS has clearly been the better team, and honestly, we were one team fight, like one major mistake away from this being a 3-0 series in favor of BDS. Game number 1 probably should have went in their direction. Game 2 was dominating, and they were definitely in control in game 3 here. It's not over. You know, K-Corp still has a chance, but they have to play better than this. Closer has simply not been good enough. He's going to get dead of the game, like I said. Massive jungle gap in this series. It doesn't really seem to matter if he's on, you know, an engager, you know, a facilitator, or a carry, whether it's Brand, whether it's Vi. It almost doesn't matter. It doesn't feel like he is just playing well. Right now, this is a player who has struggled in some pivotal moments and definitely lost his confidence a lot last year. I'm not surprised to see him underperforming in a big moment. Kana was also really bad in this game. Not too much that Gnar can do, but his laning was horrible. Like, he just continued to give over things over and over again, just made bad decisions, had some mental lapses. Kana's had a couple of these over the course of this year. I'm sure that the lack of communication is kind of the reason for that. I imagine that it's not easy being somebody that's never played outside of Korea, coming into Europe and just expecting to be one of the better players in the region, but it's really not clicked for him and for this team. Vladi, Upset, and Targamas continue to not be the issue, but the top side really has been, so much so to the point where this team probably should have just gotten swept in this series, and so their backs are up against the wall. Yes, they should have gotten swept, but they didn't. They're still alive, and game number 4 is still one that they very much can win, and if they win game 4, all of a sudden things have completely turned around. It's a winner-take-all game number 5. Getting to that point is obviously going to be the most important thing, but anybody can win once we get to that point, so a major game number 4 coming up. Can K-Corp keep this series alive, or is BDS going to slam the door on their hopes of getting into the season finals? Well, the winner of game number 4 was K-Corp. They are going to take game number 4. They are going to tie up this series at 2 apiece, and we are going to a Silver Scrapes game number 5. As it was destined to be in this series, this was Casey's best game of the series by far. This is not even remotely close. They just outplayed BDS. They understood where they wanted to take advantage of their comp and, you know, how they wanted to get their leads in the early game. They ended up getting gold onto the right members, and all of a sudden the game becomes a lot easier when BDS isn't controlling everything in the mid game. Congratulations to K-Corp. This is the shot in the arm that they needed. We just talked about it. Everything that's happened in the first 3 games, like, yes, BDS has probably been better in all 3, at least in terms of gameplay, but none of that matters. The series is now sitting at 2 apiece, and you're 1 game away from moving on to top 3 and moving on to the season finals, and that is what you have to grasp onto mentally moving into this 5th and final game. But let's talk about game number 4. It's actually a pretty easy one to talk about. They just identified where they were able to put a lot of their resources early, most notably into the side lanes, top and bot lane. Kana did a really good job of getting super far ahead, of shutting down Adam. They put a lot of priority into making sure this R5 Scion didn't really get to do anything in this matchup, and trust me, we will talk about the Scion in just a second, but Kana and Closer did a really good job in that avenue, and then a lot of the gold in the mid game ends up going onto the Zeri, and that's all you really need. Like, all you need is for the Zeri to get ahead here. The moment that that happens, this game is unwinnable for BDS, because Corki, Kaisa, Brand, like, it's a lot of damage, but Zeri can honestly outduel a lot of them so long as you are able to pull apart the rest of the team, or alternatively get, like, Viego, Kennen, Alistair to really pop off in a lot of these 5v5s. Both are obviously good routes, and, you know, Upset was able to get that gold. He's gonna get player of the game here for game number 4. I like Upset. I think he's really found a nice niche over the second half of this year where he just kind of needs to be part of the team. He's not really the resource getter that he has been for a majority of his career, but I think that's really helped. Vladi has been the best player, and they've been able to play through a lot of tempo that they get out of the middle of the map. So long as Upset is there to be able to win in the mid to late game, that's all they really need him to do. Limit the roles of your AD carries right now. That's honestly the best thing that you can do unless you have a superstar in that role. Upset has been playing a lot better since that change. Targamas has also been playing significantly better ever since they started moving away from attempting to win the 2v2. Just transition him into the part of the game that he actually is good at, and that's the mid game. That's where he really was shining on G2. That's where he was a good player when he was doing really well, when he led the LEC in assists, when he broke the assist record in the LEC. You know, that's what the game plan was for him and Flakked, was to be that weak side bot lane. Let him do that again. Let him get out on the move on things like Alistair in the mid game, help out his jungle, and not really have to be this really talented mechanical laner all the time. I think that this is really a style that helps them play a lot easier. Closer gets back on comfort. Viego is one of the picks he's played the most over the course of his career. Kana looked very good on the Kennen, and Vladi was definitely there on the Tristana. No real negatives to give K-Corp, and that's honestly the first time I've been able to say that in this series. But for BDS on the other side, they continue to just be inconsistent. You know, we talk as if, oh, you know, BDS should have 3-0'd here. We talk as if they've played great. The reason that they're sitting here and it's 2-2 in this series and not a 3-0 is because they've not been playing well. My concern is not that BDS has been awesome, rather that both teams have been concerningly bad, and that definitely carried over for BDS here in Game 4. Adam is once again going to get done of the game. He just cannot seem to find any semblance of consistency. He gets targeted here by K-Corp. They obviously put a lot of effort into making sure this Scion is behind. He's like 2,000 gold down by the mid game here, and there's literally nothing that he can do. And at that point, you can see that he is just completely mentally boomed. He's tilted, and that's something Adam has obviously struggled with in the past. It was clear that that was the direction that K-Corp wanted to head in. Honestly, it was kind of precursed in the previous series where it looked like he was kind of mentally out of it. He's got to snap in, because if he doesn't, this team is doomed. Like, they are really relying on him to be one of the better players on this team. Sheo has been stepping up. Nuke has been stepping up, but they can't do everything. You can't expect them to be the stars that they were through a couple of games here. Ice and LeBrav are obviously expected to be great, but you gotta have that star performance elsewhere. Adam is supposed to be that for this team, and he is just quite frankly not right now. Bot lane also had their worst game of the series. That's not even remotely close. Ice really wasn't very good in this game at all. He didn't really do anything. A couple of weird positioning errors on the Kai'Sa. You know, he was running into a strong team. I'm not going to try and sit here and say that it was all his fault. LeBrav getting caught out in a lot of situations was kind of his fault. Not a great game from him, but the bot lane in general, I think, had a lot of problems for BDS here. They're going to have to bounce back, because if Ice is losing, this team cannot win. Full story, like, end of story, full stop at that point. And Sheo and Nuke were just kind of along for the ride. BDS relies so much on their side lanes to be able to generate pressure early and to stay consistent, moving into the late game, that when they can't win, it's problematic. And now, regardless of how anything has gone, it's 2-2. You're going into a game number 5. It is winner take all. If BDS wins this, they move on to top 3. If they lose this, they don't really lose out on anything. It's kind of just a pride thing at this point. Obviously, they probably still want to go and try to be champions, but, you know, getting 3rd versus 4th doesn't really affect them all that much, but it does really affect K-Corp. If they are able to win this deciding game number 5, they will get themselves into the season finals after going 10th in the first 2 splits. A miraculous turnaround for this team. Can they complete the story? Well, the winner of game number 5 was BDS. They are gonna take game number 5 for the first time in 2024. They are gonna move their way into the top 3, and unfortunately, this means that K-Corp has officially been eliminated, not only from the summer playoffs here, but from 2024. They are done. Their year is over. They will not be making the season finals. It's very much a sad end, considering how this team played towards the back half of the year. I think there's a lot to like about this team moving forward. Vladi, in particular, is really a kind of player that you can build around that I think could be a really big piece for them moving forward. And obviously you have Kalist coming up next year. You've got a lot of exciting pieces here for K-Corp. I wouldn't be too worried that things didn't go your way in 2024, when I think 2025 could be a lot better, but unfortunately BDS was just better on the day. And I think that that was just the case for a majority of this series, with the exception of game 4. I really don't think that BDS ever really looked like the worst team here, and I think that that really shined through in game number 5. I think games 2 and 5 were definitely the most dominant from them, but, we'll go ahead and talk about it very quickly here. Player of the game is going to go to Labrov here in game number 5. This felt like a super easy choice, an unbelievably good Rakan game from Labrov. He's a high-profile performer. He is somebody who I've raved about on this channel in the past. I'm really not afraid to tell you guys just how good I think he individually is as a player. He continues to be awesome for BDS, and, Ice gets a lot of attention, and Ice, rightfully so, gets a lot of the praise from the community. You see a lot of people saying that Ice is a beast and that, a great team should consider picking him up. G2 or Fnatic should consider bringing him on. I agree with that. I think Ice is great, but, Labrov is part of the equation as well. He has been a big reason why Ice's transition has been so seamless, and both of them have been excellent across this split. But Ice is going to get my player of the series. All of that to say that the bot lane really is, kind of the standouts here for me. Ice was clearly the best player for BDS across all 5 of these games. I think Broadcast ended up giving it to Nuke. We'll talk about this in a second. I do not understand that. He would probably be my 4th choice for player of the series. I would probably go Ice, then Sheo, then Labrov, and then Nuke in terms of the whole series, but I don't really, it is what it is. It's a very weird vote, but Ice was the clear choice for me. This guy just continues to carry BDS even in situations where they don't even want to be carried. They don't even want to be in situations where they're trying to win. He will force them into that. So he was the best player in this series, and I don't even think it was remotely close. Sheo was the other player I considered here. His Sejuani in both games 2 and 5 were game breaking. Like, you look at the difference in games 2 and 5 when he was able to get that champion and, every other game this series, it is night and day. Not that he was bad at all on the Morgana. In fact, maybe you could argue the Morgana was the best game that he played in this series, but he is just so good at these facilitative type of champions that allow the rest of his team to really take control. He was awesome in this series, and I think he's going to get underrated for just how good he was. Nuke was fine. I think he was at his best here in Game 5 on the Lucian, but outside of that, he just kind of was there. He was okay on the Cassio earlier on in the series as well, but I certainly don't think he stood out, and Adam definitely had his best game here in Game 5, even if the rest of the series he definitely was a little bit more tragic, but BDS is just going to be happy that they are moving on, and for K-Corp, this is obviously a very sad way to end your split, but I don't think you can look back on this negatively at all. Getting 4th place after going back-to-back 10th is still a pretty big accomplishment. Just making the best of 5 stage, I think, is really nice for this team. Unfortunately, Targamas is going to get dud of the game. He got mega gapped here in game number 5. I do want to at least add some context to the Targamas conversation because he is the worst player in the LEC, or at least he was the worst player in the LEC over the course of this year. I don't really think that's all that debatable, at least in terms of individual performances if you're accounting all 3 splits. However, he got better over the course of this year. He was honestly pretty good in their playoff run. When you're talking about how this bot lane ended up performing, he was pretty good in these best of 3s. He just was kind of bad here in game number 5. He was honestly okay for the rest of this series as well. I just don't see the negative inclinations that Targamas is getting for this series in particular outside of this game number 5, where it definitely felt like he did get gapped a bit. Just the kind of context that I want to throw out there. I don't think Targamas is a player that I would be advocating for by any means, but I certainly think he's been better over the past month than people will give him credit for. I also think Topside just got obliterated, right? That certainly brings something up. I think Closer was by far the worst player on the Rift today. Closer was just horrendous for K-Corp, and quite frankly, he is maybe the single biggest reason why this team is getting out right now. They had a very easy shot to win this series if his pathing, if his gameplay really in any facet was good. It just wasn't today. He was worse than Targamas in every, conceivable capacity outside of game number 5. Kana also pulls out the R5 Akali top in game 5 and gets absolutely destroyed by the Olaf in the lane matchup. Really not what I would have done. Definitely not the decision I would have made. Vladi and Upset continue to be the strength of this team. Unfortunately, Upset is likely out next year with Kalist coming in as their young wonder kid AD carry, and Vladi is definitely someone that they're going to build around, but I imagine this team looks very different in 2025. At the very least, it feels like you finally found yourself some semblance of a core to potentially try and build around and some semblance of success, even if that didn't necessarily come to fruition here in 2024, but congratulations to BDS. They move on now. Also, congratulations to Giant X, who now officially has qualified for the season finals with K-Corp being out of it. GX is going to take that 6th and final spot. We'll see how Jackie's is able to do in that tournament, but BDS now moves on to the top 3, and we'll be covering that series right now. But moving on to our semifinals now, I'm incredibly excited to talk about this series. We get to talk about one of these teams back-to-back. That's certainly a fun one, but A much more interesting team is added to the mix, in my opinion. It's the number 3 seeded G2 Esports taking on the number 2 seeded Team BDS. We just saw how BDS qualified to get here. Of course, we saw G2 lose to Fnatic in the winners finals last weekend in order to get here as well. That certainly was a bit of an upset. Fnatic winning over G2 for the first time in what I think was 4 years in a best of 5, something like that. Yeah, I think it's been a while. At the very least, it's been a while. And so, G2 now down here into the lower bracket, and honestly, there is reason to believe that potentially G2 could struggle a bit in this matchup. Not because I think they match up poorly at all against BDS. In fact, I think it's the opposite. They match up incredibly well into BDS, especially with the strengths and the weaknesses that BDS has had in recent weeks. However, there is a real thought and a real fear that G2 is just not giving it their best effort right now, quite frankly, if only because they have absolutely nothing to gain. They have not only already qualified for the season finals as the number 1 seed because they have won both winter and spring, but you also do kind of have to question how much another random title in the middle of the year actually matters to this team and this org and these players and just the overall vibe of the culture. Like, how much do they want to win all 3 splits? That's definitely the big motivating factor, I think, for them moving into the end of summer here, but how much are they going to be locked in? That's definitely going to remain to be seen. For BDS, we know that they're having some good performances. Ice and Labrav are playing excellent right now. Ice, in particular, has been a real star for them. Sheo, I thought, looked great in that series against K-Corp. Nuke has been okay. Even if Adam is struggling, you would have to hope that he'd be able to get things together. However, the concerns for BDS are just how poorly they have generally matched up into G2, not only this year, not only this split, but basically since these two teams have been in the LEC together. Ice and Labrav are really the only lane I can look at and potentially say, like, yeah, I honestly kind of favor BDS there right now. Hans and Mickey are fine. Hans is like a good AD carry, not a great AD carry, and Mickey has really been struggling for a majority of this year, but we know when they're both playing well, and especially when the rest of the team is generating resources, both of them can be put into excellent positions where they look like the best bot lane in the LEC, but Ice and Labrav might just be the best bot lane and the most consistent bot lane right now in the LEC, but every other lane I definitely have some concerns. Sheo was really good in that previous series, but Yike should just be better than him in terms of this jungle matchup. Adam, I think, matches up very poorly individually into Broken Blade, not only historically, but just in terms of, like, their champions. He's not the kind of player that has a pool that's going to be able to take advantage of Broken Blade's more, let's just say, aggressive picks, and Adam is already kind of out of form at the current moment, so that's a bit of a concern. And then Nuke has historically been absolutely destroyed by Caps. Like, it has never really been close when these two play against each other, and I don't really see any reason for that to change here. BDS is definitely going to be coming in as the underdogs, but, watch out, right? Like, anything can happen. G2 could not take this series seriously. We could be looking at BDS getting back into the finals for the first time since last spring, and that would certainly be an interesting conundrum, but G2 are definitely the favorites here for a reason, so we'll have to see how things end up working out, but of course, going game by game means we get to start with game number 1, and the winner of game number 1 was BDS. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to carry that momentum over from their quarterfinals win, and they're going to go up 1-0 in this series. Now, I'd love to sit here and tell you that this is the start of BDS just outplaying their current perception, that we were all too low on them, that they weren't taking the rest of the series seriously, and they're going to lock in against G2. I'd love to be able to tell you all of that is true, and perhaps it will be. This is a really nice win. They were the better team here in game number 1, and they deserve to come out on top. However, there are also other concerns here, most notably G2 notoriously loses game number 1. This is kind of the thing that they've done all year. Both of the finals that they have won so far, they lost game number 1. When you look back, they lost game 1 to Mad in the winter finals, and they lost game 1, of course, to Fnatic in the spring finals. And, typically speaking, they just kind of figure things out. They end up winning games 2, 3, and 4, and the series ends up not being close. I'm not saying that that's what's going to happen here, but what I am saying is that you can't count this team out after one loss. However, BDS was definitely better here in game number 1. This wasn't some fluke victory. This wasn't, a game that they lucked themselves into. They were better here in this first one. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game, it's going to go to Adam in the top lane. I think you could point out maybe some players that were a little bit more dynamic in terms of the damage. Nuke had a really good game here on the Lucian, very similar to what he did towards the end of the series against K-Corp. I thought Ice and Labrav continued to look awesome as the 2v2 in the bot lane. lane. They are just the best bot lane right now. Rahel and Luan were the only ones pressuring them, but they're, of course, out of the tournament. Sheo had another good performance. We'll talk about Yike and maybe the bad decisions he made in terms of his build a little bit later, but Adam really stepped up. He has historically played really poorly into Broken Blade in terms of the 1v1 in the top side, and then something like Ornn, it's not necessarily something you would expect to really pop off or change the game, but he was excellent, absorbed a ton of pressure, and was way more useful in the late game teamfights. Broken Blade did have a gold lead, as is expected in this lane matchup. Rumble should do relatively well into the Ornn early on, but Adam survived. Honestly, he did well enough to be able to maintain his pace, and he was significantly, like basically doubly as useful as Broken Blade in the back half. Broken Blade really struggled to have a teamfight impact on a teamfight champion, and that's really not ideal, and Adam did not have those same issues, and so I definitely wanted to reward him with player of the game. But as I've already stated, everybody else on this team also played well for BDS. A couple of missteps here or there, most notably by Nuke, where he would just step up a little bit too far sometimes, but the damage that he was able to put out on the Lucian was way too consequential to not consider him one of the more valuable players in this game. Sheo with a beautiful smite on the Baron to be able to end up stealing that one and really pull control back in favor of BDS. Ice and LeBrav were essentially perfect throughout a majority of this game. Really not a ton of negatives to give to BDS. Perhaps you wanted to see their early game be a bit more dominant, but they were better for basically all of this. A couple of weird missteps in the mid game that ended up not really mattering, so good on them. And then for G2, again, I'm not going to panic and freak out that they lost game number 1, kind of something that this team likes to do. I just don't want to see them continue to do it moving forward. Broken Blade and Yike were definitely the two players that I was looking at as underperforming in this first game. Yike is going to get my dud of the game, though, for the build. He goes full AP on the Maokai here with First Strike, and honestly, I just don't understand. Why would you draft Rumble if that's what you wanted to do? If you wanted to go AP Maokai, then perhaps you could go something different in the top lane. It just felt like kind of a compounding version of your resources when you like desperately needed someone that could frontline really reliably in the late game, and it turned out to really matter. Nuke was absolutely deleting Yike in a lot of these fights, and it ended up costing them a couple of objectives where Shea was just able to walk in and get that smite off because Yike couldn't play nearly as aggressively without those tank stats, and so the Maokai not really being all that effective. Generally speaking, I don't think Yike's pathing was also that good. He loses some pivotal 50-50s down the stretch. Just not a particularly great game number 1 from Yike, but Broken Blade also just needed to be better. He did okay in lane, but he should have, and then he was really bad in these team fights. A lot of weird ultimates, just not really understanding how he needs to position on the Rumble. Just some weird mistakes that I think he will clean up, but he definitely needs to clean up. Caps continued to be good. Hans and Mickey were generally fine. Mickey definitely, kind of paid the price for a couple of bad engages down the stretch of this game, but for the most part, it was the top side of the map that really let G2 down, and they are the ones who are going to have to step up if this team wants to equalize, which I'm sure they want to do here in game number 2. Of course, getting to 2-0 would be absolutely ginormous for BDS. That's when you start panicking if you're a G2 fan, but if G2 can tie it up at 1 apiece, all of a sudden we're moving into a best of 3. G2 immediately wrestles back control of being favorites in this series. So, what's going to happen in game number 2? Well, the winner of game number 2 was G2. They are going to take G2, game number 2 here, and tie up the series at 1 apiece. This was a much more G2-esque performance, although certainly not a perfect one. Honestly, BDS probably should have won this game as well. This probably should be 2-0 in favor of them. G2's going to feel pretty lucky to be able to walk out of this second game with a win, but they did play better in the back half of the game, and so I'm not going to sit here and say that, BDS, won the game. I'm not going to sit here and, do what I did for BDS in game 1 of that Corp series, where really it went 40 minutes of BDS dominating and then one bad mistake ends up costing them the game kind of thing. Like, that's not what we got here in game number 2. This was definitely BDS having full control and them just not being able to close it out. G2 was definitely better basically from 20 minutes onwards, and I think that's the most important part of the game right now, and so G2 definitely deserved to win this one. The biggest gap was clearly in the mid lane. This is kind of what we expected from this series, not because I think Nuke is a bad player, but because he is voodoo cursed against Caps, especially in these best of 5s, where he has just performed really horribly. Caps is going to get player of the game. The Corki looked awesome, really drove a lot of the plays that were being made in the back half here, and he was doing an infinite amount of damage in a lot of these fights at the end of the game. There was just no way anybody from BDS was ever going to be able to keep up. Of course, there were other members of G2 that were doing things. I thought Broken Blade had a much better game here on the Ornn. This is a lot more of what I thought G2 might want to go towards. The Rumble definitely makes sense in terms of composition and in terms of letting BB play super aggressively on the top side, but this just gives you more options for allowing the rest of the team to kind of do the things that they want to do. Hans and Mickey were definitely better here. Hans was really good on the MF. He actually did a lot of really fun things in the early laning phase, and Ice's Ashe has actually been really difficult to end up beating. Ice was still very relevant in terms of the ultimates throughout a lot of this game, but Hans was way more valuable in terms of the actual team fight damage, which is essential, I think, for G2 to be able to win this series comfortably. Mickey, I thought, was actually really good in this game. A couple of fantastic engages on the Nautilus, but, there are still some concerns. Yike had another game where it is still a little bit concerning. Sheo got out to an absolutely ginormous early lead in the jungle. The Taliyah was massive for BDS on that R5 pick, and Yike really had no answer for it. The Zyra clearly is not kind of working out, and Shea has just been better than Yike through the first 2 games here. Yike has to be better. I kind of expect him to be. I'm a big fan of Yike and his game. I think he's undervalued by the community as a whole for what he offers to this G2 team, and I think he'll be just fine, but for now, Caps is going to have to be enough to get this team over the finish line, and at the very least in game number 2, that was the case. For BDS on the other side, Nuke is going to get done of the game. There's just not a lot I can say for it at this point. It feels like he is kind of cursed against G2, that Caps just kind of has his number. There are some matchups where it doesn't feel like you're ever going to be able to overcome the mental disadvantage that you have going into it. We've seen it in the LCK with Zeus into Doran, where, Zeus is probably a better player, but Doran just clearly has some knowledge of the matchup against Zeus that allows him to win it 1v1 basically every time. It's kind of similar here with Caps and Nuke, where it just doesn't feel like Nuke has that confidence to be able to play the way that he normally does into Caps. Hopefully that can be fixed, but this was not a good Lucian game. I think there were some concerns with Ice and Labrov. Like I said, Hans and Mickey were definitely better. Ice was pretty good for a majority of the early game, but he was not doing anything once this game went long, and he was getting picked off early in fights. Labrov also needed some better engages. If you are looking for a positive, as I've already said, Sheo was very good here in game 2, just as good essentially as he was in game number 1, and they're going to need to lean on him if he can continue to have these really great early games. Statistically speaking, they're going to be able to win this series if you have a bunch of these, but he needed to be more valuable in the latter half of the game. All of the gold ended up going onto this Taliyah early on, and they basically did nothing with it. He was not a primary damage threat in any of these team fights, and they really didn't push their tempo after 20 minutes nearly as hard as they needed to. So some concerns, I would say, overall, but at the very least, they are still able to generate early leads, which is still one of the more valuable things you need to do. I think closing things out is hard, especially against a team like G2, but you got to learn how to do it, and they've got to learn fast, because now we're moving into game number 3, all tied up at 1 apiece. As I said before, this is the most important game in the series, in my opinion. Winning this puts you in such a dominant position in terms of mental, just trying to get and stay on track. And so very important for both of these teams to give their best in game number 3, but who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 3 was G2. They are going to take game number 3. They are going to go up in this series for the first time 2-1, and they have taken full control of everything once again. This was kind of similar to game number 2. I think this one was definitely more in favor of G2 as opposed to BDS kind of running the early game of game 2, throwing it all away. This was still a game where BDS got out to an early lead, where Sheo got quite a bit of gold onto himself, and they established a bit of pressure, but it was kind of, the fire was put out pretty quickly. We'll just say that. G2 definitely got themselves into a good spot. BDS was significantly too passive throughout basically the entirety of this game, and it led to their downfall. They were waiting for G2 to make a mistake, and G2 didn't really make a mistake. They relied upon their superstar carry in the mid lane and just kind of went from there. And it's a pretty similar story to game number 2 in that regard. Player of the game is once again going to go to Caps in the mid lane. Didn't really have to think about this one all that much. He is just a star for this team. He absolutely obliterates BDS. It's always been a bit of a problem for them, but it continues to be an issue as we watch it here. He was inside lanes constantly, just pushing out, waiting for his opportunity to take fights, and then when they did inevitably take 3v3s or 4v4s or a 5v5 in the back half of the game, he was going to do infinite damage because BDS essentially just allowed him to fully scale up as a Corki. Yeah, that's going to be a bit of a problem for BDS in the late game. They didn't really have an answer to that. The rest of this team was also relatively fine. Broken Blade was doing a good job in side lanes as well to not overextend and put himself in bad positions like BDS was trying to bait out. Hans and Mickey weren't making mistakes. Yike wasn't making mistakes. That's really really kind of the general story here for this game, as BDS was just sitting and waiting for something to go wrong for G2, like they did for Corp and like they did for GX in previous series. They were waiting for something to kind of just be off and to capitalize on the mistakes, but G2 is not the kind of team that's just going to make these random mistakes that other teams are going to make, and they ended up paying the price for it. So congrats to G2. Caps looked good, but outside of that, I'm really not like super enthused about the individual performances from these players. And then for BDS on the other side, we already talked about their game plan. They still did a good job of, getting early leads. I think their laning has been really strong in not only this series, but across this entire year. Their 1v1s or their 2v2s in the laning phase, they're really good. Sheo's a great early game pather, and he's really improved in that respect. He was really solid there in this series and in this game. It just didn't really matter. The Karthus was able to get some kills in the back half, but really at the end of the day, they weren't able to generate any gold in the mid game. They just kind of slowly faded into obscurity. I'm not going to call this like a Rogue-esque performance, but I think there are going to be some people online that talk about Rogue when they talk about this game number 3, because it really was just kind of waiting for something to happen, and then G2 eventually won the game, and it's kind of a boring way to talk about it. There really isn't a lot of analysis that I can give on that front. Nuke is once again gonna get dud of the game. His positioning is just really bad. That's 3 straight games evolution, 4 if you include the end of the series against Corp, and the last 2 have really been horrendous. Caps has completely outplayed him at every given opportunity. He was significantly worse inside lanes. BDS was the one waiting for mistakes. He was the one making mistakes. Nuke was the one overstepping and putting his team in bad positions, so that's not ideal. Adam was also just completely outplayed. On the top side, Ice and Labrov continue to essentially be a non-factor in these games, which is really bad for BDS considering just how important those two are towards their success. But at the end of the day, this was a mentality problem. They have to put their foot on the gas. They're now down 1-2 in this series. Their backs are up against the wall, and they're 1 game away from being eliminated. If you want to stay alive, you can't play the kind of game that you tried to play here in game number 3. You have to be more aggressive. You have to understand that we can win the early game. We can pressure them out of these 1v1 or 2v2 laning phases. We just need to translate that into mid-game aggression. We have to be able to try and close it out as quickly as possible. That simply has to be the game plan for BDS and G2. Right now, just do what you're doing. You clearly have a good understanding of how to close games and how to keep things close. Even if you're not perfect in the early game, you're not making egregious macro errors, and that's going to be good enough to win you a lot of games here at the LEC level. And so I don't expect to see a massive change from G2, but BDS has to turn on the pressure or their season will be over. Is that going to happen, or is G2 going to drop game number 4 and push us to a Silver Scrapes game number 5? Well, the winner of game number 4 was G2 Esports. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to close out this series by winning it 3-1, and they will be moving on to the finals for a chance to defend their back-to-back-to-back trophy here in the LEC. Was it ever going to be anything else? Was it ever going to be anything other than Fnatic versus G2? We had all convinced ourselves that maybe there was a chance, but BDS really never stood a chance. This was an okay series from them, all things considered. I honestly don't think they played all that bad when you take everything into account. This was a pretty good game number 4, and honestly, they had an early game lead in all 4 games here against G2. They just weren't able to close out 3 of them, which has definitely got to be a bit of a disappointing end to the summer split for them, but I don't think they're going to be all that disappointed. I honestly think this was a pretty good run for them, all things considered, but for G2, a really massive victory. We'll quickly touch upon game number 4 because there are some interesting things to talk about in terms of this game. Certainly not a perfect one, but one that is at the very least intriguing to kind of analyze. Broken Blade is going to get player of the game. This is absolutely not up for debate. That Mundo was genuinely unkillable by the end of the game. Not buying anti-heal against Mundo is certainly a choice, and man, they just had absolutely no answer. Ice made some pretty questionable decisions down the stretch. Of course, not buying anti-heal is certainly the first one, but more pressingly, just some of the weird decisions that he made, some of the weird overstepping that he did. He honestly wasn't very good in this series against G2, and they really rely on him in order to get their leads and to close off their games. It's not a coincidence that the one series where BDS really struggled to end their games, their late game hyper carry didn't play particularly well, and that's going to be something to continue to monitor moving forward, but Broken Blade was unstoppable. I mean, Mundo certainly went where he pleased in this game, and You got to give him credit for that. Broken Blade, not perfect throughout all of this series, but certainly at his best here in Game 4. Caps is going to get Player of the Series. Was this ever in doubt? I mean, come on, dude. Caps absolutely massacred this series. Nuke stood absolutely no chance. We will talk about it in a second, but Nuke, again, I can't stress this enough, has some sort of voodoo curse against him when it comes to him playing against G2, where he just plays so much worse than he plays against any other team. Caps, I'm sure, has a lot to do with that, but it's yet another Player of the Series for Caps. He's gotten a billion of these over the course of this year. Hansama was also pretty good, didn't really have to do all that much, was kind of just along for the ride, if you will, for G2, but is worth throwing out because Yike and Mickey definitely had some more questionable moments. Mickey was generally like I think this was his worst game here in game number 4, but outside of this, he was pretty fine for a majority of this series, specifically in game 3. But Yike, man, Yike did not have a good series. He was clearly the worst jungler of these two in terms of the matchup, and that's just not really what I anticipated. He's going to have to be better in the finals if they want a chance at getting revenge against Fnatic, but if Caps is playing like this, it's not going to be close. It's all up to him individually as a player. He's so far and above everyone else in the LEC, and we saw that here. Broken Blade was generally fine. In the back half, Hans was okay. You know, there are some concerns for G2, but mostly I think they're going to be fine. And then for BDS, you know, there's at least something to hang your hat on in terms of this series. You probably knew you were going in to lose this one, but at least you put up a fight. I think Labrav was awesome in game number 4 here. Quite frankly, he was excellent. Adam gets a pentakill on Cassante. You know, Sheo was generally the better jungler throughout the entirety of this series. Unfortunately, mid lane did not go your way. Nuke is going to get dud of the game. That's his 3rd straight one in their 3 straight losses here. Not a really good series from Nuke. Again, it's some sort of curse. It's some sort of mental block that he has, but he just cannot play against G2. It's every single time that these two play in a best of 5. I can't even explain it at this point. Nuke is quite frankly just allergic to G2. It is a ridiculous thing. Someone's going to have to look into the stats on it because he might like genuinely have some of the worst stats against G2 with the amount of games that he's played of anybody ever. Like, it is truly atrocious. And then Ice also, like, his scoreline looks good. He was the one they were investing a lot of resources into because he is Ice and because he's their late game carry, but just wasn't able to kind of put that back out there and make it worthwhile. A couple of mistakes, and like I said, he wasn't very good in the series as a whole, but I don't think BDS is going to be too angry at going third in all 3 of the splits so far in 2024. They're going to be in the season finals, and they're going to have a chance to play their way to Worlds. If they end up getting 3rd in that tournament as well, they will get a chance to go to Worlds, and that would obviously be a positive, but they need to clean up on a lot of things. The LEC is very weak right now and really does not have a ton of strength and strong teams. BDS might get that 3rd seed by default, but it's not definitely for sure with the way that they played over the course of these last 2 series. But for G2, they now have to go on to the finals and try to get their revenge against Fnatic, who took them down for the first time in many years in the winners finals. We'll see if that ends up going their way, but at the very least, they're going to get a chance to defend their back-to-back-to-back titles. All right, but that is going to do it for my LEC semi and quarterfinals overview and analysis video. The bracket is updated on the screen. We've only got 2 teams remaining. Fnatic, of course, coming from winners finals, and G2 attempting to get their rematch. And I'm really excited to see where this goes. G2, for me, are pretty clear favorites in this series. I get that Fnatic won the last time these 2 teams played, but it went to 5 games. It was very close, and G2 just has not been stoppable in the finals over the course of this year so far, including by Fnatic in the spring finals. And so, for me, G2 definitely have to be considered favorites going in, but Fnatic looks stronger now than they have, at least domestically, at any point this year. And so, if they were ever going to be able to take down G2 2 times in a row, this was going to be the time. So, we'll end up seeing how that ends up going. I would love to know your thoughts and opinions on who you think will win that series down in the comment section below. But if you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about the LEC, we post about all 4 of the major regions. That's the LCS, LEC, LCK, and the LPL every single week, as well as the NACL, Tier 2 down in North America. So if you're interested in a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.